Welcome to Time in Tune. This is where music meets memory and every note tells a story. She had everything: wealth, beauty, elegance. Raised in a world of silk curtains, gilded mirrors, and crystal chandeliers, her life shimmered with privilege, but beneath the surface of perfection lay a quiet tragedy. Her childhood wasn't a fairy tale, it was a rehearsed performance, a march toward sacrifice, dressed in diamonds. Across the Atlantic, another world was coming undone. Britain's noble class, though cloaked in centuries of prestige, was facing economic ruin. Their titles still carried power, but their ancestral homes were crumbling, and so were their fortunes. One such heir, born into the glory of a historic palace, found himself trapped by grandeur he could no longer afford. What followed was not a love story, but a transaction, a strategic alliance between money and title. On one side, a family seeking royal connection; on the other, a title holder in desperate need of wealth; and in the middle, an 18-year-old girl with no voice in the matter. This is the story of a young woman who wore a crown she never wanted, a life shaped by others, silence, and opulent halls until she found the courage to reclaim her own voice. A duchess by design, but a rebel at heart. Stay with us as we unravel the journey of the reluctant aristocrat who dared to rewrite her fate. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in 1877 into one of the wealthiest and most influential families of the Gilded Age. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was the second son of William Henry Vanderbilt and the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch who built the family fortune through railroads and shipping. Though not the eldest son, William K. inherited a substantial portion of the vast estate, which he expanded through business ventures and high society alliances. Unlike some of his relatives, William K. had little personal ambition for political or social dominance, preferring a life of leisure, horse racing, and transatlantic travel. Yet, his fortune and name made him one of the most powerful men in New York. Though he was deeply involved in the business world, William K. showed little interest in using his wealth to dominate society in the way that his wife, Alva, intended. He was relatively passive when it came to family matters, often leaving parenting decisions to Alva, who had a sharply different vision for their daughter's future. While he indulged Consuelo and adored her in his own quiet way, he rarely stood up to Elva's controlling behavior. His detachment from the domestic sphere allowed Elva to mold their daughter without interference, paving the way for the life-altering decisions that would later define Consuelo's fate. Her mother, Elva Erskine Vanderbilt, born Elva Smith in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, was a woman of fierce intelligence, social ambition, and iron resolve. After the Civil War disrupted her family's fortunes, Elva moved north with her mother and siblings, eventually settling in New York. She was educated in Paris and fluent in French, which set her apart in the socially competitive world of Manhattan's elite. Elva first met William Kissam Vanderbilt through her childhood friend and future sister-in-law, Consuelo Iznaga, who introduced them while they were both part of New York's emerging society set. At the time, William was the shy and somewhat reserved second son of the immensely wealthy Vanderbilt family. Alva's charm, wit, and determination intrigued him, and the pair married in 1875 when she was just 22 years old. While William was content to enjoy the family fortune quietly, Alva had grander ambitions. She was determined to break into the uppermost tier of New York society, dominated by families like the Esters, who viewed the new rich Vanderbilts with disdain. Alva orchestrated lavish balls, built magnificent homes such as Marble House in Newport, and used her wealth and cunning to force her way into the social elite. But Alva's ambitions didn't stop at social acceptance. She wanted titles, prestige, a permanent seat among the aristocracy, not just for herself, but for her children. And in her eyes, marrying Consuelo into European nobility would be the ultimate triumph. From a young age, Consuelo's life was orchestrated with precision. She was educated by private tutors, fluent in multiple languages, and instructed in fine arts, etiquette, and diplomacy. Her every step was choreographed to groom her not simply for society, but for royalty. She was not raised as a daughter, but as a symbol, a future duchess in training. Alva managed Consuelo's upbringing with an iron will, dictating her diet, posture, wardrobe, and reading materials. Letters between them revealed a complex, often strained relationship rooted in control and expectation. Alva denied Consuelo autonomy over her social interactions and even censored the friendships and romantic interest she entertained. Her daughter's future, Alva believed, was a matter of strategy and legacy, not love or happiness. Behind the luxurious settings of Newport mansions and Fifth Avenue ballrooms, Consuelo lived under emotional surveillance. Her life was wrapped in silk but bound by beauty, and at the center of it all was a mother determined to make her daughter a duchess at any cost. In 1895, at just 18 years old, Consuelo Vanderbilt became a symbol of the Gilded Age's most glittering yet heartbreaking alliances. She was married off to Charles Spencer Churchill, the ninth Duke of Marlborough, an aristocrat whose lineage was impeccable, but whose fortunes were fading fast. Blenheim Palace, his ancestral home, stood as a monument to grandeur, but behind a stately facade was the looming threat of financial collapse. The solution to his problem came not in the form of political maneuvering or estate management, but in marrying one of America's richest heiresses. Consuelo, however, had other dreams. Her heart belonged to someone else, a modest, kind-hearted suitor with no title but genuine affection. She had no desire to become a duchess, but her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, was a woman of indomitable will and social ambition. Alva was determined that her daughter would not only elevate the Vanderbilt name into the British aristocracy, but would also serve as the shining example of the dollar princess trend, American money in exchange for noble titles. When Consuelo resisted, pleading with her mother and clinging to the hope of marrying for love, Alva responded with emotional warfare. She locked Consuelo in her bedroom and pretended to be gravely ill, teetering on the brink of death from grief over her daughter's disobedience. Under the weight of guilt and pressure, Consuelo relented. The wedding that followed was one of the most extravagant events of the era, held at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York City. It drew 2,500 guests and captivated the attention of both American and British society. Consuelo wore a magnificent gown in a regal air, her beauty dazzling all who saw her. The press hailed the union as a fairy tale, the American girl who would become a duchess. Golden carriages paraded through the streets, and the Vanderbilt fortunes shimmered in pearls, lace, and imported silks. But behind the delicate veil, Consuelo wept. She was marrying a man she barely knew, for reasons she did not believe in, sacrificing her freedom and happiness for status and obligation. Her dowry of $2.5 million, which is equivalent to nearly $90 million today, rescued Blenheim Palace from financial collapse, but it cost her more than money. It cost her the right to choose her own future. As Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo fulfilled her duties with unwavering grace. She bore two sons, John and Ivor, whom she adored deeply, finding in motherhood a rare source of joy amidst the constraints of her gilded life. She poured herself into their upbringing, often writing affectionate letters and assuring they received not only privilege but also warmth and guidance. Publicly, she championed charities, advanced causes for the poor, and upheld a dignified image that inspired admiration on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet, behind the grand facade, her marriage was devoid of affection, a union bound by duty, not love. Her heart, so present in her role as a mother, remained absent in her role as a wife. Charles was proud, cold, and emotionally distant. He treated her more as a status symbol than a wife. There was no affection, only function. Even their intimate life, she later wrote, felt like another duty. Her wedding night, she would say, was the sacrifice of a young girl to the ambitions of her mother. The Duke's control was suffocating. He dictated her wardrobe, her conversations, her presence in public. Decisions were made without her input, even regarding her children. Consuelo was little more than a silent figure in a grand palace, a duchess by title, a prisoner by circumstance. Though she embraced her charitable work and supported causes like education and healthcare, her personal life remained desolate. Blenheim Palace, with its grandeur, echoed with emptiness. Eventually, the cold facade of Consuelo and the Duke of Marlborough's marriage could no longer mask the emotional void between them. While they maintained public appearances for years, the truth of their unhappiness simmered beneath the surface, especially within the walls of Blenheim Palace, where duty reigned and love had long since fled. Charles Spencer Churchill, the Duke, grew increasingly captivated by Gladys Deacon, a striking and sharp-witted American socialite with piercing blue eyes and a deep intellectual curiosity. Gladys, known for her beauty and fierce intellect, had long admired the grandeur of Blenheim and the legacy of the Marlborough line. The Duke, for his part, was drawn not only to her appearance but to her boldness. Gladys was no demure society belle. Their affair became an open secret, whispered about in drawing rooms across England and America. What made the situation more scandalous was that Gladys often visited Blenheim while Consuelo still lived there. Consuelo, with grace that belied her private humiliation, tolerated the visits for some time, but the tension was undeniable. Rumors circulated that Consuelo had been effectively sidelined while Gladys began to assume a more central presence in the Duke's life. In her bitter twist, the woman from whom Consuelo had once been sacrificed, her mother Elva, would later support Consuelo's decision to leave the marriage, having come to regret her earlier coercion. Meanwhile, Consuelo herself was not without solace. She found comfort and companionship in several discreet friendships with men who showed her genuine respect and affection. Most notably, she developed a close and tender relationship with Charles Vane Tempest Stewart, the Marquis of Londonderry, a charismatic politician and fellow aristocrat. Their bond was emotionally rich, though never formally acknowledged as a full-blown affair. Vance Tempest Stewart offered her something her husband never had: gentleness and admiration. These quiet liaisons, while not as publicly scandalous as her husband's, allowed Consuelo to reclaim some sense of emotional identity and independence. Eventually, the fractures in Consuelo and the Duke's marriage grew too wide to conceal. By 1906, the two formally separated, their union long drained of affection and marred by emotional distance and control. For years, Consuelo had lived as a duchess in name only, a figurehead trapped by title and duty. In 1921, their marriage was formally annulled by the Vatican, a rare and powerful gesture of liberation that reverberated far beyond high society. The Church recognized what had been whispered for years, that Consuelo had been coerced into the marriage, a pawn in her mother Alva's social ambitions. The annulment was not just a legal undoing, it was a moral and philosophical reckoning. For Consuelo, it marked a return to selfhood. It validated the young girl who had once begged to marry for love, not status, and it stood as a quiet triumph of truth over tradition, of individual will over societal expectation. Shortly after the Duke of Marlborough remarried, this time to Gladys Deegan, an American intellectual known for her beauty and wit. At first, it seemed a more suitable match, but whatever romantic hope once existed between them soon eroded under the weight of their own flaws. Gladys, eccentric and emotionally volatile, clashed with the Duke's increasingly rigid and suspicious temperament. His need for control, already suffocating with Consuelo, turned paranoid and cruel. In a grim irony, the Duke, who had once treated Consuelo as little more than a decorative acquisition, found himself entangled in a far more chaotic and destructive relationship. He locked Gladys out of Blenheim Palace, relegated her possessions to another wing, and left her to descend into a life of seclusion and estrangement. Gladys spent her final years alone, living as a recluse in the shell of a once grand marriage. It is here that the threads of fate seem to loop with a certain poetic justice. The Duke, who had gained a fortune and a duchess through force and pride, ultimately built himself a gilded cage and found himself locked inside. Where he once exerted power and control, he was now left with emptiness and silence. In the end, it wasn't just Consuelo who was freed from the weight of their union, it was the Duke who was burdened by its ruin. Consuelo, in contrast to the hollow grandeur of her first marriage, eventually found the kind of life she had long been denied. In 1921, she married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and wealthy textile heir, not for title or wealth, but for love, affection, and understanding. Jacques adored her not as an ornament or a social asset, but as a woman of depth, intelligence, and quiet strength. Their marriage was marked by companionship, laughter, and mutual respect, the very elements so painfully absent from her union with the Duke. With Jacques, Consuelo blossomed, no longer bound by her mother's iron will or the Duke's cold authority. She lived on her own terms, far from the gilded cage just of her past. She stepped fully into herself. She threw her energy into philanthropy, aiding war refugees, supporting hospitals, and championing education for young girls. A cause perhaps close to her heart as someone who had once been denied the right to choose her own path. In later years, Consuelo reflected on her journey not with bitterness, but with grace and perspective. She had been a duchess, yes, but more than that, she had been a survivor of parental ambition, of societal expectation, of a loveless marriage. She endured, and more than that, she found love and purpose on her own terms. Consuelo documented her extraordinary journey in her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. She recounted not just the extravagance of her world, but the cost of a life lived for others. She maintained lifelong friendships with figures like Winston Churchill and returned to Blenheim Palace not as a duchess but as a guest. She had become a symbol of quiet, strength, grace, and resilience. Her story echoed that of many dollar princesses, wealthy American women traded for British titles, but unlike most, Consuelo reclaimed her destiny. She died in 1964, not as a duchess, but as a woman who dared to rewrite her story. Consuelo Vanderbilt lived a life scripted by others until she took the pen for herself, a duchess by arrangement, a woman of conviction. Her story stands as a quiet testament to the enduring power of the human spirit that even when life begins in sacrifice, it can end in peace, and that the truest nobility comes not from titles or palaces, but from living honestly, loving freely, and choosing oneself. Thank you for watching. If you're as intrigued by Consuelo's journey as I am, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Her story is one of history's quiet rebellions, and it deserves to be heard.